She grew up in a house where the FBI sat outside in parked cars, and the phone might be tapped. Her father's name was in every newspaper for 20 years. She watched him go to prison, and she was at his side when he died. But the story of Victoria Gotti isn't just the story of being John Gotti's daughter. It's the story of a woman who fell in love with a man her famous and dangerous father specifically did not want her to marry, and married him anyway, and then spent 19 years inside a marriage that turned out to be everything her father had tried to warn her about. The real story is more complicated than the tabloid version, and the part most people have never heard is where it actually begins, in a high school in Queens, with a girl who just wanted to be ordinary. Howard Beach and a childhood in the shadow of everything. Victoria Gotti was born on November 8, 1962, in Brooklyn, New York, the first of John and Victoria DiGiorgio Gotti's 5 children, the only daughter among 4 brothers. She came into a household that was, from the outside, a modest working-class Italian-American family in the specific world of Howard Beach, Queens, a neighborhood with deep roots in the Italian immigrant community, a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's family and where the rhythms of life were organized around church, school, extended family, and the specific code of the street that nobody talked about but everyone understood. Howard Beach, in the early 1960s, was a particular world. It sat in the southwestern corner of Queens, bounded by Jamaica Bay and the Belt Parkway, the kind of neighborhood where the same families had lived for generations and where your name was already known before you walked in the door. The Italian-American community that had built itself there across decades of immigration and assimilation maintained its specific social codes with the consistency of people who understood that the codes were the infrastructure of everything else. The trust networks, the business relationships, the mutual protection that organized life in a world that was always, to some degree, operating outside the frameworks the wider society officially endorsed. From the inside, the Gotti household was already something more complicated than it appeared from the street. John Gotti was, in 1962, not yet the Dapper Don or the Teflon Don or any of the other names the newspapers would eventually give him. He was a young man with a criminal history and a place in the hierarchy of the Gambino crime family that was growing but had not yet reached anything like its eventual peak. The family lived in the kind of modest circumstances that Italian-American families of that neighborhood and era inhabited. A 2-story house, old-fashioned family values, the specific working-class dignity of people who kept their homes clean and their children fed and their business private. Victoria was, by her own account, the quiet one, the shy one. She was so quiet in her early childhood that her parents genuinely worried about her development for a period. She describes them having suspected she might be autistic, based on how withdrawn and uncommunicative she was compared to the boys around her. She was not autistic. She was simply a girl who preferred to observe rather than to perform, who internalized rather than externalized, who was building an interior life while the exterior one was still waiting for the right material. She attended St. Helens Catholic School in Howard Beach, then Franklin K. Lane High School in Brooklyn. The Catholic school trajectory was typical for the Italian-American families of her world, and the education it provided was both academically solid and socially formative. The same classmates, the same priests and nuns, the same families moving through the same institutions across years that built the specific kind of community solidarity that the neighborhood valued. She was doing what the daughters of that world were expected to do, attending the right institutions, associating with the right people, developing toward the right kind of life. Her father's world was always present in the household, even when it wasn't visible. The FBI surveillance of John Gotti was a fact of life for the whole family well before his arrest and trial years. The awareness that the household was being watched, that the phone calls might not be private, that the men in the car down the street were not neighbors, was the atmospheric condition of the Gotti children's upbringing, the specific background radiation of a life organized in proximity to serious organized crime. You grew up knowing things that you did not discuss. You grew up understanding that there were two versions of the world, the version that other people saw and the version that was real, and that navigating between them required a specific and permanent vigilance. Victoria navigated it by retreating further inward. She read. She wrote. She developed the skills of observation and narrative that would eventually make her a writer. First a newspaper columnist, then a novelist, then a memoirist. The girl who was too quiet to be understood was actually watching everything, absorbing everything, storing it all for a later use she could not yet fully describe. And then she met Carmine Agnello. Carmine Agnello, the boy from the neighborhood. Carmine Agnello was born in 1960 in Ozone Park, Queens. The same general world as the Gottis, the same Italian-American community, the same neighborhood networks and social codes that organized life in that part of the borough. Ozone Park and Howard Beach were adjacent neighborhoods with overlapping worlds. The families knew each other, the kids went to the same schools or the rival ones, the church communities and the street communities intersected in ways that made the geography of the two neighborhoods feel like a single extended space. He was 2 years older than Victoria, and he had grown up in the specific context of the streets of Queens, navigating the same world that produced the Gambino family and many of the people associated with it. His own trajectory was already moving toward the criminal world by the time he and Victoria encountered each other in their high school years, not yet fully formed as a criminal enterprise, but already oriented in that direction, in the way that young men in those neighborhoods, who had certain qualities and certain connections, tended to orient. He would become, in law enforcement terminology, a made member of the Gambino crime family, a formal status that meant specific obligations and specific exposure to the federal prosecutions that were already, by the late 1980s, systematically dismantling the New York organized crime world. He was her first real boyfriend. Victoria has described him this way herself, with the specific precision that characterizes how she tends to speak about the Carmine years, not romanticizing what it was, but acknowledging that it was first, and that first has a weight that subsequent experience doesn't diminish. She was not someone who had a series of high school relationships leading up to him. He was the one who got there first, in the specific and formative sense. What she saw in him in the high school years when they first encountered each other is the specific combination of qualities that women who grow up in neighborhoods like that, one tend to recognize. He was physically imposing. The nickname, the Bull, that law enforcement would eventually give him suited something that was already visible in how he carried himself. He was confident in the way of someone who had figured out how his world worked, and he was attentive to her in a way that made the quiet, overlooked girl feel specifically and importantly seen. He saw her. In a household where she was the girl surrounded by brothers, in a neighborhood where the girls were measured by specific criteria that the quiet observer didn't always meet, Carmine Agnello paid attention to her. There was something that happened between them before the marriage that matters to the whole story. According to testimony given in 2007 federal court proceedings in approximately 1979, when Victoria would have been about 17 and Carmine about 19, Carmine Agnello committed an assault against her. Her father, John Gotti, found out about it. John Gotti's response was not a call to the police. It was the response of a man who operated entirely within the rules of the world he had built his life in. Several Gambino associates ambushed Carmine Agnello, beat him with a baseball bat, and shot him in the buttocks. It was a message, delivered in the specific language that Gotti spoke when a message needed to be sent. Carmine would understand what the message meant. He would understand who sent it and why. And he would understand that this was not an invitation for the relationship with Gotti's daughter to continue. Victoria continued the relationship anyway. The specific dynamic here, a daughter defying her father over a man her father has specifically demonstrated his opposition to in the most dramatic possible way, is not simple, and Victoria Gotti has not pretended it is simple. She has spoken about this period with the complexity it deserves, acknowledging the defiance, acknowledging what the warning was, acknowledging that she chose to discount it in favor of what she felt. She was young. She was in love with the first person who had ever made her feel genuinely seen. She believed, in the way that young women in love believe, that what she knew about Carmine was more important than what her father had tried to demonstrate about him. The tragedy is that she was not entirely wrong about either thing. The marriage her father didn't want. Victoria Gotti and Carmine Agnello were married in 1984, 22 and 24 years old respectively, with a history that already included the specific episode her father had responded to so dramatically 5 years earlier. The wedding took place over John Gotti's stated objections. Victoria's parents were against the marriage and said so clearly. Carmine's connections to the criminal world, his existing history with organized crime, and the specific episode of 1979 all gave the Gotti family reasons to oppose the union that went beyond the ordinary parental preference for a better match. There is something worth understanding about what it meant for Victoria to go through with this marriage against her father's expressed opposition. John Gotti was, by 1984, not simply a disapproving father in the conventional sense. He was a figure of genuine power in the Gambino organization, about to become its boss within the next year, a man whose word carried weight that extended far beyond the family dinner table. His opposition to a marriage was not the ordinary paternal reluctance of a man who simply doesn't like his daughter's choice. It was the expressed opposition of someone who had already sent a violent physical message about that choice, and who was now opposing it in the clearest possible terms. Victoria went forward, and in doing so, she exercised the specific kind of autonomy that requires either real courage or real certainty or both. The willingness to look at everything her father knew and had done and was telling her, and to say that she understood it, and was doing this anyway. The early years of the marriage, before the legal troubles began to accumulate, had their genuine moments of normalcy and genuine warmth. They moved from the working-class world of Howard Beach toward the more comfortable world that Carmine's business income made available. They were building a family. The loss of Justine in May 1985 and the cancer diagnosis that followed it were devastating in ways that brought them together in the solidarity that shared grief can produce. And then the miracle of 3 more children, the sons who defied the medical prognosis and arrived across the next 5 years. Her son, Carmine Agnello Jr., was born in 1986, John in 1987, and Frank in 1990. The 3 boys she raised, often described as miracle babies, given the medical prognosis that had preceded them, became the primary organizing fact of her adult life in the Agnello years, and later the central subjects of the reality television series that would make her a public figure in her own right. Victoria was managing all of this while pursuing her writing career. She has spoken about the specific challenge of finding the time and the mental space to do creative work inside a demanding domestic life, alongside a husband whose world was generating its own constant noise. She found it. The columns got written. The books got published. The career was built. Both things ran simultaneously, which is what women in every generation have always been asked to make work. Her father's trajectory was running in the background of all of this. The acquittals in the late 1980s, the Teflon Don mythology, the 1992 conviction. Victoria watched all of it from a position that was simultaneously inside the family and outside the specific criminal world her father inhabited. She was his daughter. She was not a participant in his enterprise. The distinction mattered to her, and she has maintained it consistently in everything she has said publicly about her father's life and death. The distinction also had a cost. The public never quite believed it. The Gotti name guaranteed that every book she wrote, and every column she published, and every television appearance she made would be understood through the frame of who her father was, regardless of what the work itself contained. She built a career despite that. The career is real. She is still writing. She is still talking. She is still the specific kind of woman that the quiet girl in Howard Beach was always going to become. Someone who observed everything, stored it all, and eventually found the words for all of it, including the parts that were hardest to say. Living the life. Howard Beach to Old Westbury. The trajectory of Victoria Gotti's life with Carmine Agnello is a specific story about social mobility in the specific context of organized crime money. They started in the working-class world of Howard Beach that both of them had come from, and they eventually ended up in a mansion in Old Westbury, New York, Long Island's Gold Coast, the world of horse properties and circular driveways, and the specific architectural extravagance of people who have money and want it to be visible. The distance between Howard Beach and Old Westbury is not simply geographic. It is the distance between the world their parents had inhabited and the world that organized crime money made available to the generation that followed. The Old Westbury mansion became, years later, the primary set for Growing Up Gotti, the reality television series that Victoria would produce and star in on A&E from 2004 to 2005. But in the years when the marriage was still intact, it was simply where they lived. A large house, 3 boys, the specific domestic world that Victoria was managing, while Carmine's business world was running alongside it in the specific parallel structure that characterized life in that milieu. Victoria had always written. Even in the years of the early marriage and the children, she was pursuing the writing career that eventually became her professional identity. She began as a columnist for the New York Post, developing the specific voice, direct, emotionally honest, willing to engage with difficult material without flinching, that would characterize everything she wrote afterward. She eventually reported for Fox. She was doing journalism at a time when female columnists in New York were fighting for space, and she was getting it, which was not simply a function of who her father was. The writing was good enough to earn its own position. She published her first book, Women and Mitral Valve Prolapse, in 1995, a medical book co-written with a physician, addressing the heart condition that she had been diagnosed with and that affects women in disproportionate numbers. The book was a genuine contribution to public awareness about a health issue she understood personally, and it was not what anyone expected from the mob boss's daughter who had been writing for the Post. It was a signal that she was doing something real with her public platform, something that was genuinely useful to people who knew nothing about the Gotti name and didn't care. Her first novel, The Senator's Daughter, was published in 1996. A second novel, I'll Be Watching You, came out in 1999. The novels were well received enough to establish her as a working fiction writer with a real readership, not simply a celebrity with a book deal. She was building something that belonged to her. Meanwhile, her father's career was reaching its dramatic conclusion. John Gotti had been acquitted 3 times in the late 1980s, the acquittals that generated the Teflon Don nickname, that made him seem untouchable in a way that the press found irresistible. his 1992 conviction on murder and racketeering charges, which came in significant part through FBI wiretaps, and the cooperation of Gotti's former underboss Salvatore Gravano, ended the Teflon Don era definitively. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He died at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, in June 2002, of cancer of the head and neck that had progressed through years of imprisonment. Victoria was asked by the New York Post to write her father's obituary when he died. She wrote it. The article appeared in the paper on the same day as his funeral. The same day she was burying her father, she was also publishing a public account of who he was in the newspaper that had covered his crimes and his trials for 20 years. It is a specific kind of task, and the fact that she could do it, and that the Post asked her to do it, speaks to both the quality of her writing and the specific position she occupied at the intersection of private grief and public record. Carmine Agnello, From the Bull to Federal Prison. The legal story of Carmine Agnello, which was always running beneath the surface of the marriage, eventually became impossible to keep beneath the surface. His relationship with the Gambino crime family was not simply a matter of background and association. He was, by the late 1990s, a formally inducted member of the organization, a made man, in the specific terminology of the American Mafia, which meant specific obligations, specific protections, and specific exposures to the federal law enforcement activity that was, by then, systematically dismantling the New York organized crime families. The FBI and the Justice Department had, through the RICO statute, and through the cooperation of witnesses at every level of the Gambino hierarchy, built the investigative infrastructure to prosecute people like Carmine Agnello. The scrap metal business was real, in the sense that there was actually scrap metal being processed and sold. But it was also real in the sense that it was a vehicle for the kind of financial activity and criminal enterprise that eventually attracted serious federal attention. The business generated income that was not fully accounted for. The business relationships were not always with legitimate partners, and the people who ran the business were not people the federal government was looking at casually. In February 1994, Agnello was charged with criminal mischief for damaging a police scooter outside his scrapyard. The episode was straightforward in its facts. A police officer was issuing parking tickets to cars outside the yard, and Agnello physically damaged the scooter. It was a minor charge, the kind of thing that, in a different context, would be a footnote. But it was a visible instance of someone who had spent his life operating in a world where authority was something to manage rather than to simply accept, responding to the ordinary exercise of that authority with destruction. The larger legal problems arrived in 2000. Agnello was arrested on charges of extortion and arson. The charges were substantial, supported by evidence developed over time by federal investigators. The prosecution outlined a pattern of criminal conduct that went beyond isolated incidents, a pattern of using intimidation and force in the conduct of his business affairs in ways that constituted organized crime activity. He was convicted in 2001, sentenced to 9 years in federal prison, and ordered to pay $950,000 in restitution. Victoria had, during the period leading up to the conviction, done what women in her world were expected to do. She stood by her husband. She posted bail using royalties from her books and whatever other assets she could access. She attended hearings. She maintained, publicly, the posture of a wife who was supporting her husband through legal difficulty. Whether her private assessment of the situation matched her public posture is something only she could know. But the infidelities were also a matter of record. Not a single episode that could be attributed to circumstances or opportunity, but a pattern. Multiple women, over time. a systematic reality that was eventually known to enough people to be beyond reasonable doubt. The infidelities represented a different kind of betrayal than the criminal activities, more personal, more specifically directed at Victoria as a woman, more clearly about who Carmine Agnello was in his private life than who he was in his criminal one. In 2003, while Carmine was incarcerated, Victoria filed for divorce. The legal grounds were constructive abandonment, a New York divorce law provision that applies when a couple has not had physical intimacy for more than a year, which in the case of a spouse in federal prison is essentially automatic as a matter of law. But the real reasons were the accumulated weight of everything the marriage had produced over 19 years. The criminal life running beneath the domestic one, the infidelities, the specific realization that the warning her father had delivered in 1979 in his particular way had been right. The divorce settlement was substantial. $12,500 per month in alimony, plus $12,500 per month for the children, for a total package estimated at approximately $7 million. It was an acknowledgement, in financial terms, of what 19 years inside the marriage had cost her. Growing Up. Gotti, the show that changed everything. In 2004, the year after the divorce was finalized, Victoria Gotti agreed to star in a reality television series for A&E. The show was called Growing Up Gotti, and it documented Victoria's life with her 3 teenage sons, Carmine Jr., John, and Frank, in the old Westbury mansion that had been the family home during the Agnello years. She was a recently divorced mother of 3 teenage boys, the daughter of the most famous mob boss in American history, and she was inviting cameras into her house. It was a calculated decision, not an impulsive one. The show ran from August 2004 until December 2005, and attracted audiences that were, by A&E's standards at the time, genuinely significant. At its peak viewership, it was drawing over 3 million viewers per episode, making it one of the network's most successful series of that period. What people were watching was not simply the spectacle of mob adjacency, though that element was clearly part of the appeal, and nobody involved in producing the show was naive about that. What they were watching was a particular kind of mother-son dynamic that was both specific to the Gotti world and also familiar in a more general way. The 3 sons, Carmine Jr., John, and Frank, were at the ages when teenage boys are most simultaneously infuriating and lovable, most visibly becoming who they were going to be as adults, most capable of generating the specific exasperated comedy that the show delivered. With their dark good looks and their Long Island confidence and the complicated inheritance of the name they carried, they became genuine television personalities in their own right. The show had a genuine warmth to it that its subject matter might not have suggested. Victoria's relationship with her sons, whatever its frustrations, was clearly a real and deep one, and that reality came through the cameras. Victoria emerged from the show as a public figure of considerable recognition. She became, in the specific cultural moment of the mid-2000s, someone whose face and name were known not just because of her father, but because of who she herself was. The mother, the writer, the woman who had survived the Agnello years and was raising 3 sons in a mansion, and was funny about it and honest about it, in ways that the reality television format occasionally actually rewards. The show was also, from Victoria's perspective, a calculated act of asserting control over a narrative that had always been told by other people. For decades, the Gotti story had been the property of federal prosecutors, of journalists, of filmmakers who were interested in organized crime as spectacle, and who had their own angles on the material. Victoria's angle. The angle of the woman who had grown up inside the story, who had married into the Gambino world deliberately, who had raised children in its shadow, who had watched her father be destroyed by the legal system while simultaneously loving him, was the angle that none of those other versions had contained. Growing up, Gotti was not a correction of the record. It was an assertion that the record was more complicated than anyone had previously acknowledged, and that the complexity was worth watching. Victoria Gotti, my father's daughter. In 2009, Victoria published This Family of Mine, What It Was Like Growing Up Gotti, a memoir that provided the most complete and personal account she had yet offered of what the Gotti household had actually been, what it had cost, and what it had meant. The book was direct and emotionally honest in ways that the reality show's format had not quite permitted, and it sold well enough to confirm that the audience for Victoria Gotti's specific voice extended beyond the viewers who had watched the A&E series. She described the specific experience of loving her father, genuinely as a daughter loves a father who is also genuinely present, while being aware of what he was and what his world produced. The father who came home from wherever he had been and was warm with his children was the same man the federal government was building cases against. The father who cried at the death of Victoria's stillborn daughter, Justine, was the same man who ordered the death of Paul Castellano. These were not two different people. They were the same man, and Victoria Gotti had spent her entire life holding both versions of him simultaneously. She described the specific psychology of growing up in a household where the public version and the private version of your family were radically different, where the FBI surveillance and the newspaper coverage and the trial coverage and the eventual conviction all coexisted with the specific ordinary texture of a father reading to his children, attending school events, being physically and emotionally present in ways that the public record of his crimes does not include because it has no reason to. She was trying to give the full account, not the partial one. The memoir was that attempt. In 2019, she co-wrote and executive produced and narrated a lifetime biopic called Victoria Gotti, My Father's Daughter, a film that traced her life from childhood through the Carmine Agnello years and the divorce, organized around the central relationship between Victoria and her father. The actress Chelsea Fry portrayed Victoria in the film's dramatized sequences, while Victoria's own narration provided the perspective of the woman who had actually lived through everything depicted. The film received the kind of attention that anything involving the Gotti name reliably generates, but it also received credit for the emotional honesty of its approach, for the willingness to show conflict and difficulty alongside love, to portray a father-daughter relationship that was real in all its dimensions, rather than either romanticized or simply condemned. Victoria described the film, in interviews around its release, as an attempt to show a side of her father that was true, without pretending that all sides of him were equally good or equally deserving of celebration. Her father is gone. Carmine Agnello has been out of her life for decades, though not entirely out of her sons' lives, which is the specific ongoing complication of divorce when children are involved. He married again in 2008, a second wife named Danielle Vangar, with whom he had a son. He had additional legal troubles in 2017, convicted again on environmental violations and other charges. He paid and moved on. Victoria moved on long before he did. She is still writing. She is still talking about the family and the marriage and the world she came from in ways that are honest about all of it. She is still the specific kind of woman that the quiet girl in Howard Beach was always going to become. Someone who observed everything and stored it all and eventually found the words. What it actually cost and what she built. Victoria Gotti is a woman who has spent her entire adult life navigating the specific cost of being born into one Gambino family story and choosing to marry into another. The cost of the Gotti name has been real and ongoing, and not always of her own making. Her father's conviction and imprisonment defined the family's public identity for decades. Her brother John Jr.'s subsequent involvement in the Gambino organization and his own legal troubles, he became acting boss after their father's imprisonment in 1992, was arrested in 1998 on racketeering and extortion charges, and navigated a series of trials that eventually produced a guilty plea in 2009. Added additional layers of public scrutiny to the family. Her brother, Peter Gotti, also faced federal prosecution. The family became, in the specific cultural landscape of the 1990s and 2000s, a multi-generational story about organized crime that the press covered with the sustained attention of something that never ran out of new material. The cost of the Agnello marriage was its own specific accounting, separate from the Gotti family account. 19 years of managing a household while the legal exposure built beneath it. The stillborn daughter in May 1985, and the cancer discovered in its immediate aftermath. Doctors telling her she would likely not have more children, and then 3 more children, defying the prognosis across the next 5 years. 3 boys who were miracle babies in the most literal sense, children whose existence required the specific combination of her determination and whatever medical factors allowed the pregnancies to succeed against the odds that had been named. The infidelities were real, and they were documented, and they were a pattern, not an incident. Multiple women across years of a marriage. Victoria has spoken about this in interviews with the specific, carefully controlled anger of someone who has processed the experience enough to describe it without performing it. The anger is present, but it is held, not displayed, in the way of someone who has decided that the person who betrayed her does not get to continue consuming her emotional energy. She gave 19 years to the marriage. She raised 3 sons. She wrote books and built a career alongside all of it. She did not receive the faithfulness that those investments deserved. She filed for divorce. She received a settlement. She moved forward. The Growing Up Gotti show ran its course and gave her sons a platform and gave her a public identity that was partly her own rather than entirely her father's. The 2009 memoir gave her the chance to tell the full story in her own voice. The 2019 Lifetime biopic gave her the chance to shape the cinematic version of that story. To be, finally, the author of the Gotti narrative rather than simply one of its subjects. Her sons grew up. Carmine Jr., John, and Frank became young men navigating their own relationships to the family history, their grandfather's name, their father's imprisonment and eventual release. The specific inheritance of being a Gotti Agnello in a world that had very strong and very predetermined opinions about what that meant. They had their own lives. They built them. Victoria watched. She became a grandmother. The girl from Howard Beach who was too quiet for anyone to understand, who fell in love with the first boy who made her feel seen, who married him against her father's specific and violent objection, who spent 19 years inside the marriage that followed, who wrote books and raised sons and attended trials and buried her father and divorced her husband and then put a camera crew in her house. She became a grandmother, which is a way of saying that the story continued, as stories do, past the most dramatic chapters. Her father is gone. Carmine Agnello has been out of her life for decades, though not entirely out of her sons' lives, which is the specific ongoing complication of divorce when children are involved. He married again in 2008, a second wife named Danielle Vangar, with whom he had a son. He had additional legal troubles in 2017, convicted again on environmental violations and other charges. He paid and moved on. Victoria moved on long before he did. What the Gambino family marriage ultimately made her was not a mafia princess in the romanticized version of that phrase. It made her someone who had been inside one of the most closely watched family stories in American crime history, twice, once through birth and once through marriage, and had come out the other side with a clear-eyed account of what she had found. The clear-eyed account is not a glorification. Victoria Gotti has never pretended that the world her father and her husband inhabited was something other than what it was. She has watched the cost accumulate across her entire lifetime. Her brother's imprisonment, her father's death in federal custody, the 19 years of her own marriage and its dismantling, the specific ongoing complexity of raising sons inside the shadow of a family history that the world has strong opinions about. She knows what it cost. She has paid most of it herself. The account is also not a condemnation. She loved her father. She married Carmine Agnello because she genuinely loved him, because he was the first person who had made her feel seen, because the love was real, even when the marriage was not what it needed to be. The love and the cost coexisted, as they always do in real lives, and she has been honest about both. She is still writing, she is still talking. She is still the specific kind of woman that the quiet girl in Howard Beach was always going to become. Someone who observed everything, stored it all, and eventually found the words for all of it, including the parts that were hardest to say. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.